It's been over 2 centuries, and till date, no one knows who this guy was. So guys, we're going to be talking about Jack the Ripper, or the legend of Jack the Ripper, in today's video. What's up guys, I'm G and I do true crime videos Mondays to Fridays, and on the weekends we try to do something fun. So if that's something that you like, consider subscribing, and every like you give to this video is one kiss for me. Nah, that's too cheesy. Every like you give to this video goes to help a long way, so thank you. So this story takes place in East London, in an area called Whitechapel, and in the 18th century it already was a horrible mess because the place was just covered in blood from slaughterhouses. Like, most of the streets was just filthy, covered in blood from the slaughterhouses. People did not particularly have good jobs, and many resulted in criminal means. And for the women, the main occupation at that time was just prostitution, because that's how they were able to pay for their bed and be able to find a place to sleep. That was their main source. That was the main job for women at that time. And a lot of people were just living miserable lives, and that resulted in a lot of drinking, and they just resulted in drinking gin, which always left them drunk. Before Jack the Ripper set in, there was already a lot of crime going on in Whitechapel at the time, because it was like mostly more like a slum, and there were a lot of unemployed people, which makes a lot of criminals, and a lot of just dark alleys, for which is just a good breeding ground for crime to go on. And a lot of crimes were against women who were prostitutes at that time. For example, I read somewhere about an Emma who had just been gang raped and killed, which was something that was more frequently seen, like women being hurt at that time. But Jack the Ripper, his cases turned out to be somewhat different. The nightmare started on the 31st of August 1988, when a man who was on his way to work just stood and saw a lady who was lying down, and probably you think it's someone drunk, but going closer, he realized that the woman's neck had been slashed twice and almost ripped off. Like, it was really a deep cut, and her stomach had been open and parts of it taken out, like chunks of her stomach taken out. She had so many cuts on it. Her face was bruised. It was just really a brutal murder, and at that time it was something really scary to see. I mean, it is something really scary to see even now, but at that time it was really just very new and really scary. And the man calls the police, and he's able to continue his day and heads off to work. Now the police and a doctor who arrived there, they ended up finding out that the lady had just been killed like a couple of hours before she had been found. And the lady was called Mary Ann, and she was a 42-year-old lady, and she was also a prostitute. And the manner in which she was murdered, it gave the doctor an idea that this was not just a random killing, or someone just like he felt like the person who committed the murder had some idea of the anatomy of a human or of a woman, the anatomy of a person. So that was giving like a focus as to who this type of crime was committed by, and the subsequent crimes would have the same handwriting on it. So the police had nothing to work with. There was no murder weapon, and it was just empty. So the police at this point have nothing to work with, but the streets are already really full and there's a lot of people, so the police are already understaffed and there's not much they can do. So the second victim was Martha Stewart. She was a 39-year-old woman, and she was also a prostitute, and she was found one morning when this guy is going to work, and he sees another guy, Charles. I'm just calling Charles, the guy he met, standing in front of the woman and just being like, hey, come see something. It's like, this woman looks dead or something. And the second guy who came, they tried, he could touch and feel like there was a faint pulse, but they both men are thinking of, hey, I have to go to work, and they're worried about going to work. I mean, I could understand, because at that time a job was difficult to come by. When you get the job, you're trying to keep it, but someone was dying, or someone had just died, I don't know. So they are on their way to work. They keep going on their way to work. They notify the police, and there was a police nearby, so he comes and checks her, and then they call the doctor. When the doctor arrived, he said, like, has the marks on her body looked exactly like the previous victim, like they were very close. The person who had done this also had some knowledge of human anatomy, and the guy, her body had also been cut open, her neck slashed twice, and her stomach had been cut open, even though some parts were not taken out of it, but it had been cut open. And he could tell that she had died just about 30 minutes before before the doctor arrived. So the guys who first saw her had literally seen her minutes after she had been killed. And the crazy part is that at this time there were some police walking around the area at that time, just patrolling, but no one saw anything, no one heard anything. And yeah, it's just weird that all of that happened and no one was able to see anything. This is a part that I really found crazy. So this lady, the reason why this lady was outside that day was because she did not have, I read somewhere that said 4 cents, but she did not have money to pay for her bed that night. And she went outside to try and make that money through prostitution. Imagine living a life where you don't have a house, you have no idea where you're going to spend the night. I mean, when you're having a rough day, you just want to go home and rest, but you have no idea where you're going to spend the night. And she literally had to go and prostitute herself to be able to pay for her sleeping, to pay for a bed to sleep that night. And she had met someone like an hour ago, and just about 1 hour later she was found dead, just out from nowhere. It was just, I just felt like it's a crazy reason why she ended up dying. Again, with this second murder, the police had nothing left. Just they had no evidence, just the body was left behind. They could see the similarities between the first and the second case. They were both prostitutes, they were both around the same age, and they were both moving around the same areas of Whitechapel, but they could not see, there was no evidence as to, they just knew that the person who had committed this crime could be the same person, but there's no idea as to who could have done this. So a few days after that, this guy is living in a building where his mother lives at. He sits down on some steps and takes off like some dirt on his leather boots with a knife. When he felt like it was okay, he took off. And just an hour after that, another tenant from the same building goes down, is about to leave for work, and then he finds another victim, a lady who is just lying down and just covered in blood. So he calls the police, and the police come over, and they find out this is a third victim. Her name is Annie Chapman, and she's a prostitute. She's 47 years old. Now, this woman her neck had been almost severed, and her stomach had been cut open. The crazy part is that her intestines had been removed and laid close to her shoulders. There were parts of her body that had been taken out, like her kidney and one of the uteruses, I think, something like that. So the scene is really nasty, and the doctors come over, and they are just able to recognize that this was not done by just, remember I said there were slaughterhouses around, this was not done by a regular slaughter guy. This was someone who knows the anatomy of a person, because they were not just crazy cuts made around, but someone who knew what he was doing. So just like the second victim, Annie as well just did not have money to pay for her bed that night, and so she was escorted out of the property because you have to pay to sleep. And then she just vanished into one of the dark alleys, and some people reported that they had heard her talking to someone. A lady actually said she had seen her talking to someone, but she was unable to see the guy because he was standing from the back. She was just able to see Annie. And it's annoying that she had to die for the same particular reason, that there was just no money to pay for her night wherever she needed to sleep. Yeah. And the crazy part is this killer at this time when he was done dealing with her, when he was done killing her, he took her stuff and just arranged it, because it seemed to be a comb and just stuff that a lady would carry in her bag and a hanky and stuff like that. He just arranged it there nicely, and there was still no way to find anything about the actual killer. And the time of her time of death was a bone of contention, because the doctor could deduce from how cold her body had gotten that she died at this time. However, the time that he put her to have been dead was more than an hour ago, and the guy who sat down to take off the stuff from his leather boot, he had just been sitting like a few feet from where she was. So if she had been killed at that time, there's no way that he could have missed that. So the doctor ended up saying maybe the morning was too cold and she had lost blood, so maybe her body, the warmth of her body maybe she just got cold faster because of that. At this point, people are just frustrated with the police. Hey, 3 people have died and it seems to be the same person, and it's just like there's a serial killer lurking around and everyone is scared. But the crazy part is the police have nothing to work with, and like I already said, the people are overpopulated. Like, there's just a lot of people and just too few police to be able to do their job properly, or to be able to have, they had nothing to work with, and there were just few of them. So the police had nothing and they were not helping, and people are frustrated. So some few days go by, and on September the 29th, they have some, at night they had some sort of a meeting, probably like a council hall meeting, something like that. And they finished early, but those who were not in the mood to go home, some people went home, but some stayed to just drink and have a good time and socialize. Now, one guy who was just returning from scene of a lady got into the hall, and 20 minutes after that, another guy who was on a horse rode past by, and he noticed that there was something darkish. There was just a figure around somewhere and there was no light. So he gets off the horse and goes down to check, and he sees another woman who is going to be the 3rd victim. But he sees the woman there and he's terrified. He does not know if she's dead or she's drunk, because she was lying sort of like this and he could only see the back. He rushes into the hall to go and check on his wife and make sure that she's okay. And when he finds out that his wife is safe and sound, he rushes outside to check on who the woman is and what is wrong with her. As this guy runs out with other people from the hall, they're coming to check on the woman, and they discover this woman has just been killed, and they're running to find the police and to try and get some help. Not too long away from that, just like a kilometer from where the body had been found, the police who had already just discovered another body of another woman. This is a different victim who had been killed, but like in Jack's style. She had been hurt several times, her neck had been cut so many times, and the intestines open, and an intestine had been put over her shoulder, and just her body had been open, and all of the stuff Jack does had been done to her. The crazy part is, this is almost at the same time, and the doctors could conclude that this lady had just died like within minutes of the time that she had been found. Because the reason why the police found that was because that was a road that a patrol police is always moving around, and it takes like 13 minutes for him to go around. But when he leaves this spot, and for him to come back to this spot, it takes about 13 minutes. And by the time he does a turn and returns, he finds a body there. And the victim who had been found near the hall where the guys were drinking, she did not sustain that many injuries. She was just cut to the throat, and she had not sustained that many injuries, which made people feel like, okay, maybe when this guy on the horse, when he came, he might have interrupted the killer while he was still in the process of killing her. And it just was so rude of him to kill 2 people, like just so close to each other, just to kill 2 people. He literally just killed this one, walked over and killed. Like, how the hell is no one able to find him? Which brings me to the suspicion of, like, it should be like a police or someone that you trust. I don't know. I'm just saying, but it was just so crazy how he was able to get away with that within few minutes and with so many people just running around those two places. So these last two murders are of Catherine Edders and Elizabeth Stride, which they range between the age of 46 and 47 years old. People are speculating he has killed more than 11 victims, but these 5 victims are like the ones that he did. Like all of his prints were on this, like his handwriting, not his actual prints, were on these. Like these are the ones that they are so sure that were committed by Jack himself. And 3 days before the murder of this double murder that occurred, there had been some letters coming into the police, some smeared with blood, and some he even wrote in the letters that it was written in the letters that the blood was getting too thick, so he was unable to write with it properly. Like the guy was just being cocky, and at the end of these letters it was signed, yours truly, Jack the Ripper, and which is where the whole Jack the Ripper got his name from. The reality is, till this day, people are not sure if it was actually Jack the Ripper who sent all of these letters, because the police ended up making the letters public because there were no typewriters at that time, and the police made the letters public hoping that someone is going to recognize the handwriting. It was really cool. No, it was really weird and really backward to catch people at that time. Actually, making this instead backfired, because a lot more letters were coming in, and people just felt like the letters' authenticity was not particularly valid. But one of the letters came in just the night after those murders were committed, and that's one of the letters that people really believe that it might have been by Jack the Ripper himself, because it contained details of the murders that had not yet been released to the press, because it was just in the morning, and that's the morning where the press is going to release all the information. So one of the letters actually said that they were going to cut one of the ears of their victims and send in a package to police, even though the police did not receive such a package. But one of the women that was killed in the last murder, her ear was cut obliquely through. So yeah. Now on October 16, there was a special delivery for a guy named George. George was just a guy who owned a business and was a leader of a group of business owners that were like, hey, we have to try to find this serial killer. So George received this package, and this package contained half a kidney. And when they actually tested it, they found out, yeah, this was a kidney of a human. This was a human kidney. And the guy said, the letter said this was the kidney of one of the victims, and that they have fried and eaten the other half. Like, people were sick even in the 18th centuries that they had fried and eaten the other half. So people are not sure, at least at that time there was no technology to determine if this was the kidney that had been removed in one of the murders earlier, but it was a human kidney, and that was scary. Not too long after that, another victim was found. Yeah, I know, it's exhausting. Yeah, just another victim, and this was just one of the worst so far, because the lady was found, so she lived in one of those houses where you have to pay to sleep, and she had not paid. She was owing. She was back on her, I don't know, rent or nightly payment, I'm not sure. So the owner of the establishment went to her room 13 to go and get his money, but when he went there, the door was closed, and so he tried to knock on the window, but no one was coming. So he tried to peep through the window to see if someone was there, but he was obstructed by clothes. So he tried to shift it out, and he saw something really terrible. The woman was lying on her bed just at the corner, but her body there was just blood everywhere. So he called the police, and the police came there, the doctors came there, and it was just a horror sight, because they had to first of all try to peek through the lock. Remember I said the woman was dead? Yeah, but her door was closed. So they had to try and peek through the lock and get into the house, and she was severely mutilated, and it was just a really horrible sight. Her face was destroyed. Her body had just been slashed all over again and again. It was really one of the worst of all the sights that had been seen, which were terrible sights. This last victim was Mary Jane Kelly, and she was just one of the youngest of all his victims so far, because she was in her mid-20s. He's always going for 30 and over, but she was in her mid-20s, and she was a prostitute, and she was the one who owned the room where she was found. But she lived there until a few days. She lived there with her boyfriend, who did not particularly like her being a prostitute, so they had broken up. However, the boyfriend had come to visit her on November the 8th, which was the day she died later that night. The boyfriend had come to visit her, but he said he just spent a short time there with her, talked with her, and then he left. Now, Mary had been seen by her neighbor with another guy who even said she greeted her, but she was she was too drunk. But she went inside her room with this guy, and she was singing, and the neighbor could leave hearing her singing. Now, another person was reported to have seen Mary again at about 2 a.m. that night, and he said Mary was with a guy who looked really well dressed. He had a hat. Like, all the witnesses that were somewhat witnesses of Jack the Ripper was just that he had a hat. So everything that you know about Jack, that we know about Jack till date, is that Jack wore a hat. So Mary's companion is wearing a hat. He was putting on, he had a glove to his side, and it was said Jack the Ripper had a really huge knife, because of the cuts he was able to make when on his victims. So this guy that Mary, the reason why Mary actually left her house that at 2 a.m. that day was because she needed some money. And so when she met the first guy, she asked for money, and he did not have money. So it is said that one of the reasons why he might have been following Mary and the well-dressed guy was because he was hoping to steal from him, which is just a suspicion. So Mary leaves, and that guy tells them until about 3 a.m. So he decides to leave and go to his home. That's what he said to the police. Now, the neighbor that Mary had left Mary singing before she went out on her own business trip, when she returned at about 3 a.m. or at about the same time, she did not hear Mary singing anymore. There was no more singing, and there was no light. So yeah, Mary Jane Kelly is widely known to be the last victim of Jack the Ripper. There are some few suspects. The 5 victims, which are often called the canonical 5, probably because it's the victims that people are exactly sure that they were killed by Jack the Ripper. And I've talked about 6 victims, but 5 of them are definitely Jack the Ripper's handwork. The 5 are Mary Ann Nichols, Anna Campbell, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Edwards, and Mary Jane Kelly. So those are the ones that are, for a fact, people were killed by Jack the Ripper. Now, who was Jack the Ripper? That is what we are going to, till date, no one knows exactly who, but they have some suspects. Some people say that because Mary Jane Kelly's boyfriend could have been the Ripper, because he was always in a fight with her about her being a prostitute. He actually hated her being a prostitute, which was what had caused their breakup. And people think that he started killing prostitutes to scare away Mary Jane from to make her scared and decide to leave the job. That was what people think. And maybe after everything that he had tried and ended up failing, he decided to leave her, but was still hurt, and that was why he came that day and killed her, even though he said he left earlier that day and spent the night in his house. But she was dead, and no one can prove what exactly happened to her. So that's he's just one of the suspects. Now, some people think of the guy who sat down by his mom's building and cleaned his shoes with a knife. People feel like, okay, maybe he was the one who committed the murder. People just feel like he was the one who was the killer because he was at that house. Even though his mom lived at that house, it was not his house, but his mom lived there, which shows that he had a reason to have been there. So that's just one of the theories. Another suspect was the neighbor who had tailed Marianne when he saw her with the well-dressed man. I mean, he was broke, so he had a reason to want to harm them or something. Or maybe because Marianne was pretty young, maybe it was just another guy who liked her and was jealous that she was going to meet a client. That's why he was a suspect. But like I said, all of the suspects we are going to talk about and the ones we've talked about, no one actually had any evidence against any of them, which is why no one got arrested and no one was tagged Jack the Ripper. Another suspect is a guy who was going to work that day, cross guy, and the first guy who saw, I don't remember her name, one of the victims, and called for the next guy to come check that, hey, someone had died. But some people are like, okay, what were you doing there in the first place? Because he was the first person to arrive the scene. And some people feel like maybe when the second guy was coming over, he was in the process of killing her, and when he saw the second guy come over, he just hid his murder weapon and pretended to be a passerby who had found someone dead. So that is that, and no one still knows. No one has any evidence, so nothing was done about that. The strong piece of evidence that was, like, it's not actually evidence, nothing was done about it, but a strong piece of conviction that people had was because this guy's normal route to go to work was where all of the victims were found, and the victims, most of the murders were committed on like early hours of the morning and on weekends or day of holidays type of things. So on his route to work, that was where all of those murders were committed, except the day of the double murder where it was a holiday and it was a Sunday, I believe. So people were like, okay, maybe that could be him. One suspect I'm going to talk about is a guy named Francis Tumulty, and he was, I think he was an American guy who was living in London at that time when all of the murders happened, but he was said to be someone who liked to dress a lot more. His dressing style was not described as what most of the witnesses could have seen whenever they saw the murders, whenever they saw someone who was murdered with someone before she was murdered. So it's likely that he's not the one. However, when this Tumulty guy died, he had two rings, and one of the victims, he had two rings that seemed a little really ancient and priceless and had a huge estate. And a certain article actually said he liked to collect human body parts, but it's not, the article was not from a reliable source. So like, he was just one of the real suspects. But and the rings that he had, like a pair of rings, which was a set of rings that had been missing from one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. So this guy is like a likely suspect, but no one can actually know who Jack the Ripper was. And I'm sorry guys, because in this case we have no closure, and it's annoying, but it was a crazy story to look at. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Who do you think Jack the Ripper is, or was? No, was, because he must have died by now. And let me know what you guys want to see next in the comment section, and see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.